In 2006, one man looked at 500 years of financial history and said America was on the exact same path as every empire that had ever collapsed. Nobody listened to him. The economists laughed. The politicians ignored it. The media moved on. His name is Ray Dalio, founder of the world's largest hedge fund, and he had spent years building a predictive model based on the rise and fall of 8 major empires over 5 centuries. Now, almost 20 years later, every single data point he flagged is flashing red simultaneously. He just released what he is calling his final warning. The internal conflict phase has begun, and history says empires don't come back from this. But here is the part almost nobody is talking about. Every single empire that has ever fallen left behind one specific signature in the final stage. A pattern so precise and consistent that Dalio says you can almost set a clock to it. I will tell you exactly what that pattern is before this video ends. And once you see it, you will never look at the evening news the same way again. By the time we are done, you will understand the big cycle, the most powerful predictive model ever built, and why the man who created it believes the clock is already running out. Ray Dalio did not just wake up one morning with a bad feeling about America. This was decades of obsessive, systematic research. By the mid-2000s, Dalio had built Bridgewater Associates into the most successful hedge fund in history, managing over $150 billion. But unlike most people managing that kind of money, he was not satisfied studying quarterly earnings cycles or short-term interest rate movements. He wanted to understand the deeper architecture. Why do superpowers rise? Why do they inevitably fall? And is the process mathematically predictable? So he did something that most economists never bother to do. He went back 500 years. He studied 8 major empires: the Dutch, the British, the Chinese dynasties, the Spanish, the Ottoman, and he mapped every measurable variable: debt levels, wealth inequality, political division, military overextension, currency debasement. The same forces acting in the same order produced the same outcome every single time. And in 2006, staring at the data for the United States, he saw something that made him genuinely afraid. America did not match the pattern partially. Exactly, not in 1 or 2 metrics, in almost all of them simultaneously. He began warning colleagues and select clients, but the housing market was booming. The stock market was at record highs, and nobody wanted to hear it. What he found in that data is the reason this story matters to every person alive today. Stop and think about this for a second. Most financial experts can barely predict what the market will do next quarter. Dalio was attempting to predict what would happen to an entire civilization over decades. How do you even begin to construct something like that? The answer is data. A staggering, almost obsessive amount of it. Dalio and his research team spent years building what he calls the big cycle model. They examined 8 major world powers across 500 years, analyzing over 30 distinct indicators. The strength of the reserve currency, the ratio of debt to GDP, the degree of income inequality, the quality of education systems, the intensity of political conflict, the capacity of the military, and the state of international trade relationships. They were not guessing or theorizing. They were finding the mathematical fingerprints of collapse, the precise sequence that plays out before a superpower loses its dominance. The Dutch Empire, the British Empire, the Mongol Empire, the Ottoman Empire, each one followed a recognizable arc. Rise, peak, and decline, driven by the same forces appearing in the same order with extraordinary consistency. And here is the part that makes your skin crawl. The average time between peak power and significant decline in Dalio's dataset is approximately 1 to 3 generations. If this research is hitting you the way it should right now, hit like and subscribe, because what we're about to uncover gets much darker from here. You are not ready for what the actual data shows. Now forget everything you think you know about how history class described empires. The big cycle is not a vague, poetic idea about nations rising and falling. Dalio identified 6 precise stages, almost like a medical diagnosis, that every major power passes through on its path from dominance to dissolution. 1. New order rises after war or revolution. Old debts cleared. 2. Resource consolidation. Peace, investment, growing prosperity. 3. Peak empire. Innovation, global influence, reserve currency dominance. 4. Overextension begins. Debt accumulation, inequality, class friction. 5. Internal conflict. Political division becomes irreconcilable. 6. Decline and loss of reserve currency status. Stage 6 is where empires do not just struggle, they collapse. And Dalio has never been shy about which stage he believes America is currently navigating. Stage 5. The internal conflict phase. The stage no empire in 500 years of recorded data has ever reversed. What makes this model so chilling is that each stage mechanically produces the next. You cannot skip stages. You cannot pause the clock. And when Dalio first mapped the United States against these 6 stages back in 2006, his assessment placed America entering stage 4. 17 years later, his updated analysis moved America firmly into stage 5, exactly as the model predicted, right on schedule. So what does stage 5 actually look like inside a modern superpower? What comes next might genuinely disturb you. Here is where it gets interesting, but also where it starts to genuinely hurt. To understand how far America has moved through the cycle, you have to first understand how extraordinarily high it climbed. In 1945, at the conclusion of World War II, America occupied a position no empire in history had ever held. It controlled approximately 50% of global GDP. Its industrial manufacturing capacity was completely unmatched. Its military was supreme across every theater. Every other major industrial power was either defeated or physically destroyed. And then, at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, something happened that Dalio considers the single most consequential event in modern financial history. The world agreed to use the American dollar as the global reserve currency. Dollar becomes the world's money. Think carefully about what that actually means. Every country on Earth must hold and use dollars to trade oil, commodities, and goods internationally, which means the United States can issue debt in its own currency, a privilege no other nation has, because the demand for dollars is structurally built into the global economy. This is stage 3, peak empire, the most advantageous position any nation has ever held in all of economic history. Britain held this position before America. The Dutch held it before Britain. Each time, the nation that controlled the reserve currency used that power brilliantly at first, and then recklessly. And the moment that recklessness began in America is almost precisely when Dalio's model predicted the decline would start. But this next fact is the one that kept me reading until 2 in the morning. In 1971, President Nixon made a decision that Dalio considers one of the most consequential pivots in American financial history. And most people today couldn't tell you it even happened. Nixon removed the United States from the gold standard. Before 1971, every dollar in circulation was backed by actual gold held in reserve. After 1971, the dollar became backed by nothing except trust. Just the collective global belief that America would remain solvent and dominant. And what did America do with this new freedom to print unlimited money? It printed and printed and printed. In 1971, the U.S. national debt stood at roughly $398 billion. Today it exceeds $34 trillion. That is an increase of over 8,000% in just 50 years. But here is what Dalio's model reveals that standard economic news coverage almost never explains. This debt does not just accumulate silently in a government spreadsheet. It actively hollows out the middle class. It transfers purchasing power and wealth upward to those who own hard assets like real estate, equities, and bonds. Wealth flows upward always, and when wealth inequality reaches a specific historical threshold, when the gap between those who own assets and those who own nothing becomes so extreme that it generates structural resentment, the cycle advances into its most dangerous and historically irreversible stage. And the next fact makes the debt crisis look like a prelude. Here is where the story takes a genuinely dark turn. Stage 5 in Dalio's big cycle is called internal conflict, and he is extremely precise, almost clinical, about what distinguishes this stage from ordinary political disagreement. Internal conflict in the big cycle sense does not mean that two parties disagree on tax policy. Every functioning democracy does that. Internal conflict means a fundamental breakdown of the shared belief. that the system itself is legitimate. When people stop trusting the institutions that hold a society together, the cycle accelerates dramatically. Think about what the last decade of American political life looks like through Dalio's lens. Not left versus right. That tension has always existed and is healthy in a democracy. But the structural, deep-seated belief that elections are fraudulent, that courts are captured, that the press is an enemy, that the opposing political party is not simply wrong but existentially dangerous. This is stage 5 language. This is stage 5 psychology. Dalio developed a specific metric he calls the political polarity index, a quantitative measure of how far apart the two major parties have moved ideologically. In 1960, despite profound divisions including the civil rights conflict, the parties overlapped significantly in the legislative center. Today, that ideological overlap is functionally zero. And in Dalio's dataset, zero overlap has one consistent historical successor, without a single exception. What is driving that division at its deepest structural level? The answer leads somewhere most people refuse to look. Let me pause here, because this next part fundamentally changes the picture. People argue endlessly about whether wealth inequality is a moral or political issue. Dalio is completely uninterested in that argument. He cares about one thing, the data. And the data says something with total, unwavering clarity. Extreme wealth inequality has preceded the collapse of every single empire in his 500-year dataset. Every single one, no exceptions. Not most of them, not the majority. Every single one. Consider the current American numbers. The top 1% of Americans now own more total wealth than the entire bottom 50% combined. The top 10% control approximately 70% of all assets. These figures are not just politically uncomfortable. They are historically extraordinary in the context of a modern democratic republic. But here is what makes Dalio's analysis so different from standard economic inequality arguments. He is not making a moral case. He is making a mechanical one. When the majority of a population loses meaningful access to opportunity, when housing, education, and healthcare become structurally inaccessible, they do not just become frustrated. They stop investing psychologically in the system. They stop believing the rules apply to them. And a society where the majority no longer believes in the rules governing it cannot sustain its institutional structure. As Dalio wrote in his research, when the wealth gap becomes too large, the rich and poor effectively live in different worlds, and eventually they govern as enemies. And now there is a foreign dimension to this entire picture that makes everything considerably more urgent. If the internal divisions were concerning, you are genuinely not prepared for this. There is an external force that is accelerating every trend Dalio predicted, and it is unfolding right now, in real time, faster than even his model anticipated. The American dollar's reign as the world's reserve currency is being openly challenged for the first time since 1944. China's economy has expanded from roughly $1 trillion in 2000 to over $17 trillion today, the fastest ascent of national economic power in recorded history. Russia, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, the BRICS coalition, have been systematically building infrastructure to conduct international trade without using dollars. Saudi Arabia, America's most critical energy partner since the 1970s, has begun accepting Chinese yuan as payment for oil. The petrodollar, the architecture that gave the United States its supreme financial power for 5 decades, is beginning to fracture at its foundations. Dalio is careful not to declare that the dollar will collapse imminently. That is not how reserve currency transitions work historically. They happen gradually, and then suddenly. The British pound lost its reserve currency status slowly across the 1920s and 1930, and then catastrophically after World War II. The Dutch guilder's decline took nearly a full century. But here is the critical threshold in Dalio's model. When the reserve currency begins losing its status, it acts like a slow poison. You don't feel sick until you suddenly can't get up. And now we arrive at the moment I promised you at the beginning of this video. Stop everything right now, because what I am about to tell you is the single most important insight in everything Ray Dalio has ever published. And it is the thing that almost nobody in mainstream conversation will state clearly and openly. Across every empire in Dalio's dataset, all 8 of them, across 5 full centuries, There existed one specific moment, one identifiable threshold, a point after which no empire ever changed course. Never, not one empire, not a single exception in 500 years of data. That threshold is the moment when internal political conflict becomes so severe and so deeply structural that the governing system can no longer coordinate a response to economic crisis. When the political machinery becomes so divided that passing meaningful reform becomes mathematically impossible. Dalio calls it the self-reinforcing doom loop. Debt forces spending cuts. Spending cuts increase inequality. Inequality intensifies political conflict. Political conflict prevents the debt from being addressed. In every historical case, once the doom loop begins, the decline becomes mechanically self-reinforcing. In 2022, Dalio published a paper, notable for its unusual directness given his typically measured language, in which he stated that America appeared to have crossed this specific threshold. The United States is now in a classic stage 5 internal conflict that, based on all historical precedent, leads either to a fundamental revolution in how things are done or to the collapse of the existing order. Do you believe this is still reversible, or has the doom loop already locked in? Comment doom loop or still time below. I will pin the most thoughtful response. And if you know someone who believes everything is fundamentally fine, send them this video. They need to see the actual data. And now, the pattern I promised you at the very beginning of this video. The signature that appears in the terminal stage of every fallen empire in Dalio's dataset. The single most chilling data point in his entire model. It is this, in every case, across all 8 empires, across 5 centuries. The ordinary citizens living inside those systems did not believe collapse was possible until it had already happened. Citizens never believed it possible. Not in Rome, not in Britain, not in the Ottoman Empire, not in the Soviet Union. The people living inside these systems normalized each incremental step of the decline. One news cycle at a time, one political crisis at a time, one economic disappointment at a time. They called the warnings alarmist. They said their civilization was different, more resilient, more exceptional than all the ones that came before. They trusted that the institutions would self-correct. And by the time the collapse was undeniable to everyone, the institutional capacity to mount a real response had already been quietly, systematically destroyed. This is Dalio's final warning. Not that collapse is certain. He is careful about that distinction, but that the window for the kind of structural reform that could alter the trajectory is closing. And the precondition for that reform, which is a shared national recognition that something is genuinely wrong, is disappearing faster than the solutions are being developed. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, the rhyme is unmistakable. The greatest risk is not the collapse itself. It is failing to see it coming until it is already too late to act. If you made it this far, comment BIG cycle below. It proves you are part of the very small group of people who actually want to understand what is happening. The truth is stranger than anything you could make up. Everything Dalio built over decades of research points to a single uncomfortable truth. Empires do not fall because of one catastrophic, cinematic moment of destruction. They fall because of thousands of small, individually explainable moments that nobody paid enough collective attention to. The debt that always seemed manageable. The division that always seemed just like normal politics. The currency that always seemed invincible. The institutions that always seemed permanent, until they weren't. The cycle doesn't care about your ideology, your nationality, or your optimism about your country. But here is what the pessimists always miss in Dalio's work. He published this research publicly, not to spread despair, not to profit from fear, but to give people the one thing that falling empires consistently failed to offer their citizens in time, a warning early enough to act on. Because here is what Dalio also says clearly. Individuals can adapt and position themselves intelligently even when the larger system cannot. You cannot stop a big cycle as an individual. No single person can, but you can understand it. You can start normalizing things that historically have never been normal. You can ask harder questions. You can read Dalio's actual work, which is publicly available, and decide for yourself what the data means. Knowledge is the only real hedge. The data does not care about your comfort. It never has. Comment BIG cycle if you made it all the way here. You are one of the very few who genuinely wants to understand what is unfolding. The truth is stranger than anything you could make up.